Hi, everyone. We're so glad you're here with us today. My name is Rachel Oswald. I'm the chairperson of the National Press Club's Press Freedom Committee, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here on behalf of the committee and the club's Journalism Institute. As the nonprofit affiliate of the National Press Club, the Institute powers journalism in the public interest. We have a live transcription with closed captioning option available during this program. If you are joining us on a desktop or laptop computer, you can enable this at any time by finding the live transcription button in the navigation menu. Click the show subtitle and the closed captioning will start. You can also disable this at any point by clicking hide subtitle. We'll be recording this program and a link to the video will be emailed to you. So if you miss something, don't worry, you'll have a chance to catch it a second time. Highlights from the program will also appear on our website and in our newsletter with the video. If you are not already receiving the Institute's daily newsletter for journalists, you can subscribe now. This program is designed as a conversation, and we hope you'll join in with comments and questions. Please share questions anytime in the Q&A queue. We'll be monitoring them and responding to them later in the program. It's now my pleasure to moderate this important discussion and to introduce our panelists. Welcome to you all and hello. It's a real privilege to spend this time with you. Today we have with us Ksenia Ermoshina, who is a senior researcher at the Center for Internet and Society based in France, as well as a senior researcher at the University of Toronto's Citizen Lab. Natalia Kropiva, who is the tech legal counsel for digital rights watchdog group Access Now, and Nat Kretchen, Senior Vice President for Programs at the Open Technology Fund, which is part of the U.S. Agency for Global Media. In looking for a program we could hold in honor of Sunshine Week this year, which is something we try to do every year here at the Press Club, I thought it would be interesting to examine this worsening trend of not just authoritarian governments like Russia and China imposing firewalls to limit their citizens' ability to access information that runs counter to their official propaganda, but we're also now seeing other countries, including countries that the United States has significant trade and security relationships with, like Turkey and India, also turning to internet shutdowns to temporarily freeze their citizens' ability, including by individual regions, to use the internet to organize politically or to protest what they may view as failed government policies. And clearly, these internet shutdown trend has direct negative impacts on journalists' ability to conduct the reporting during key moments of political unrest, and also to be able to make sure their reporting is accessible to the audiences that most need to read it. We're going to have time later in the discussion to review some of the circumvention technology tools the private sector and the public sector through institutions like the Open Technology Fund have developed for journalists to use to get around these internet shutdowns. But for now, let's go a little deeper into what is driving this response by some governments. To start off, I'll pose this generally to the panel. What are some of the common tactics that authoritarian or illiberal governments use to prevent the public and journalists from accessing the internet? Natalia, do you want to take that first?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Hope you can hear me well. So I will be speaking here from my role at Access Now as a tech legal counsel, and I also work closely with our Keep It On coalition and various branches of organization that document shutdowns and censorship. And so we are seeing a lot of censorship, blocking of websites, that is being used as this authoritarian sort of a tool to restrict information. We're also seeing that circumvention tools such as VPNs and browsers and so on that people use to access the blocked websites are also being restricted, blocked, and outlawed even in some countries. And then through our Keep It On coalition, we also see, which is a coalition that documents and monitors internet shutdowns around the world. We just published our recent report for 2022, and we are seeing that there is an ongoing and disturbing trend of governments also implementing full internet blackouts and also blocking of entire messaging platforms such as Facebook, WhatsApp, and so on. And this past year, we have seen 187 shutdowns across 35 countries, which is a disturbing trend. This is the biggest amount of countries that we've seen so far that shut down the internet in a year. And then other tactics include as well repressive laws. So for example, sometimes you don't need to block a certain website in order to prevent people from accessing it. So for example, countries like Belarus, they designate certain Telegram channels as extremists, and then anybody who joins them or interacts with them can be charged. And so they don't need to block Telegram. They can successfully prevent a lot of people from accessing through this kind of repressive laws. And then threat of surveillance is another last trend that I want to mention, is that it's also preventing people from accessing internet, especially in countries like Russia, China, Iran, where governments exert a lot of control over the internet infrastructure, and there is a lot of surveillance happening, so individuals can also be afraid often to access the internet.
Great, thank you. That was really comprehensive. Nat, Ksenia, anything you want to add to that about what's going on?
Yeah, I would second to what Natalia just said, especially about the latter point. And I wanted to precise that what I saw from my research, especially on Crimea and its annexation by Russia in 2014, and then what followed this year and last year during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there is another trend which consists in a more deeper infrastructure level hijacking of traffic, which is not directly connected to censorship. It's rather connected to who owns the networks and where does the traffic go. Is the traffic from this territory controlled by Russia or by Ukraine? And if we answer this question, we will see completely different internets. And for example, Crimea existed for 3 years between 2014 and 2017 as a country with two separate routing regimes. One was controlled by Russia, other was still Ukrainian. So users could access Ukrainian news media, independent Crimean Tatar media, while others whose traffic was connected to Russia were actually unable to get all these independent information sources and were facing Russian censorship. So this is more on the architectural and infrastructural level, which is also a trend in other countries. And another thing which is connected to this one is about the topology, the internet topology. So what we saw from our research with the Citizen Lab, but also with the Center for Internet and Society, is that the more we have internet service providers in a region, the harder it is for the government to actually control it. So the first actors to control are mobile operators. And we see that mobile internet is vital for journalists because they report directly from the field during protests, elections, or other important political events, and mobile data, mobile connectivity is as important as water or electricity during these times. So what governments would do is start with mobile operators, because there are often very few of them, 2, 3, 4 maximum. And we saw it in Belarus, for example, in 2020, in August, during the protests, that mobile traffic was slowed down, was throttled importantly. So it was not a total shutdown, but it was so considerable, so important that actually people could barely use messaging apps and had to hop between various solutions to be able to connect to the outside world. So I would say that the more centralized internet service provider markets are, and the more centralized the network in a given territory is, the easier it is for the government, for the repressive government, to control it.
Wow, that's pretty grim. Nat, anything else on that?
I mean,
front?
obviously, very comprehensive from Natalia and Ksenia. Maybe the only thing I would add to that, which I think is probably self-evident given the both range of tactics and how those tactics manifest differently depending on the particular infrastructure you're looking at in the country is just a way that I think I like to bucket up some of the tactics sometimes that it probably comes from Molly Roberts' research most directly, but it's kind of between like friction, fear, and flooding as three basic kind of potential ways to approach things. So friction is what we're thinking of in terms of technical barriers erected to stop folks from accessing content, whether it's, throttling that's plausibly deniable, censorship, all the way up to complete network shutdowns. And then I think the fear is self-evident in terms of self-censorship, often enabled by surveillance. And then, flooding is one that we see a lot these days, which is essentially, misinformation counter messaging to the point where you're occupying a space so much that it effectively serves as a form of censorship. And so there's a ton of technical variation and a ton of contextual specifics that can happen under those three. But that's a little bit of bucketing that I think we tend to do.
Fascinating. Ksenia, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just a short addition. I forgot about it, but this is very important because it's a trend. And we are speaking about trends now. It's a trend to block and to criminalize the usage of circumvention tools. So basically, more and more countries are able to block certain specific VPN protocols. And they are able to do so because they have more and more sophisticated filtering solutions like deep packet inspection and other technologies that give sensors the ability to filter and block on a very granular way, much more nuanced than before. And we see in Russia, for example, but also in Iran and elsewhere, that VPNs are blocked and people try to look for something else. But this is a teaser for another part of the panel, so I'm just...
Okay, great. So I think we can still benefit from some more table setting because most of our audience are Americans, and one of our benefits is we've had an open internet, so we may not be as familiar with some of these concepts and terminology. I'm kind of interested if Natalia, Nat, you want to respond to this, firewalls versus the internet shutdowns you've been talking about, and why some countries might choose a comprehensive firewall the way China has, but other countries are kind of being very innovative and all these things that you guys have just listed in their ways to throttle, to flood the scene, and maybe where you think things are going to go. Do you think we're going to see more countries choose firewalls, or we're going to try to see them be very adaptive and innovative about when they shut down the internet?
Maybe I'll start just to comparing, because Russia and China always often compared, but I think it's important to remember that they have different backgrounds and contexts, right? China has started controlling the internet quite early, and we see right now have a lot of people in China who have never experienced free internet, and so it is easier. They were less connected before, while Russia has, despite its sort of digital repression starting probably around 2011, 2012, but still up until the recent couple of years, the internet has been largely still free, relatively free, especially for businesses. There was a lot of interconnection with the global infrastructure. Businesses, individuals have been, relying on, payment services, website, even like bloggers, would post on Instagram, influencers, and so on, even people who are not really, talking about politics. And in recent years, I think, especially after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we have seen a drastic change. And so it is harder, I think, for Russia, both politically and technically, to do the same type of firewall as in China. But nevertheless, I think, and this is where Iran is coming as well as example, is that Iran has also lived under sanctions for a while and haven't had access to the same technologies as many other countries, but nevertheless, it was able to have its own internet. It's not super effective, but it does the job. And so in this case, I don't think we will be able to see the same exact version of the internet as in China. For countries who have been connected in the past, or maybe who don't have as much technological capacities as China, but still, I think they will try to do something like this. If it's maybe follow example of Russia, of Iran, and try as much as possible, as Ksenia mentioned, use of DPI technologies that are, could be accessible sort of off the shelf, and try to implement them to be more targeted in terms of what they are blocking, as opposed to a complete 100% control of the internet. And in fact, we are seeing more and more of that, is that now their governments are selecting certain platforms to block rather than do full-scale shutdowns.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't agree more. And I think I want to make sure to plus one Natalia's point about just like the social dynamics of lib censorship in a way that when we're working with folks in China, the vast majority of them don't really have a conception of what they would want to get beyond the firewall to look for anyway. Thus, like going through the trouble of adopting a circumvention tool to get there just doesn't seem worth the effort. Whereas in Russia, you still have a lot of folks who are used to accessing global services and they feel actively deprived of something. And that's a motivating factor that can then cause them to take action. So those are the kind of dynamics that we often get asked about that aren't fundamentally related to technical solutions as much as they are just like lived experience and kind of that changing political context. In terms of the difference between kind of censorship regimes like, China and increasingly Russia and some of the places, India, Ethiopia, where we see kind of network shutdowns and less pervasive censorship. I think Access Now has a slightly different framework than the one that we tend to use because it's, I guess, a little more based on kind of outcomes, in which like technical censorship of person-to-person social media networks are kind of considered to constitute shutdowns. But like as a technology funder, I think we generally organize things based on the tactic employed by authoritarians to prohibit access. So like technically blocking specific sites we think of as censorship, while kind of severing entire networks we're generally classifying as shutdowns. And so the reason that I think is useful for us is it both frames how those tactics tend to manifest for the authoritarians. Generally, when you're setting up a censorship regime, you're thinking kind of long term. These are things we don't want our publics to have access to over the long term. There are short-term censorship events, but often, we're trying to set up an internet where fundamentally these kinds of information are not available, versus a shutdown scenario where generally that's like, whether it's planned around elections or even school exams or kind of response to political unrest or protests, those tend to be, I think, a little more in response to like a real world crisis rather than a steady state. And then for us, in terms of thinking about technical solutions, it's just a lot harder to find mitigations when you don't have network connectivity to work with. So, the shutdown scenario just means you're going to have a suboptimal mitigation in a way that the censorship, circumvention, cat and mouse were on a little bit more equal footing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So do you see when you look at the world map, do you see any regional trends like certain regions are moving in this direction and their governments are favoring these types of censorship or shutdown responses? Anything you want to talk about on that? And versus throttling, filtering, flooding, fear of surveillance. Natalia and Nat again, if you want to answer that.
Well,
Natalia,
I can start. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, sorry for promoting our report, but this basically it outlines all of the answers to these questions. There are trends. I mean, some of them are recurring, like, for example, India already, like, I think 5th time in a row already is leading in shutdowns. They are also continuous and ongoing. But also we see some new countries, like, for example, Armenia, like it was the first time documented to have a shutdown, and they blocked TikTok. And it is also a trend that we see more and more of shutdowns occurring in the context of conflicts and war. So we have seen also shutdowns used in against by sort of warring parties, right, and to disable infrastructure for the military, but also the civilian population. So, for example, in Ukraine, we've seen Russia attack the infrastructure, which resulted in internet outages all over Ukraine, but specifically in the areas with the biggest fighting. And as Ksenia mentioned as well, Russia is also trying to reroute internet from Ukrainian providers onto its own sovereign internet. And we have seen 14 outages in Ukraine as a result of Russia's attacks. We also see it in Yemen by Saudi-led coalition also attacking infrastructure. And so there's a lot of sort of this association between violence and human rights, severe human rights, sometimes war crimes, and internet shutdowns. We also see sort of, repeat prolonged shutdowns, so they last longer, and they affect also a lot of, a big number of people. And there's also ongoing shutdowns, like, as I said, India, but also Tigray, Ethiopia, Myanmar. We're seeing a lot of countries now that are already from 2022. We now see at least, I think at the time of the report was published, it was at least 16 shutdowns that were ongoing and going into 2023. And the last one I want to mention is that, as we mentioned, right, we also see this sort of targeted shutdowns where governments sort of becoming more sophisticated and intentional, and they also want to prevent the economic consequences of full-scale shutdowns. And so they are becoming more selective into the block platforms, or they try to, like, as Ksenia also mentioned, for example, target mobile internet. So this is also becoming a trend, and we see, like, in Kazakhstan, for example, last year in January, there were a huge and devastating, really, shutdowns during the mass protests with a lot of violence, and government even saw that their own websites were affected and the economy suffered tremendously. And so now to improve the situation for themselves, they decided, okay, well, we will designate a number of websites that we will not shut down. So, like, the opposite, they do like whitelists, hoping that it will solve the problem, but I'm not so sure, because still implementing any kind of blocking and shutdowns, it destabilizes the infrastructure. So we will see how that's going to go. But I'm just trying to say that governments are trying to find sort of new inventive ways how to make it easier for themselves to control the internet and disable, certain part of websites and information, make them inaccessible to people.
Okay, I actually want to come back to that if we have time in our Q&A, because I didn't have a prepared question, but your remarks actually have my reporter's brain, like all these follow-ups I want to ask. Nat and Ksenia, anything else you want to add to what's driving these regional choices?
I mean, I think the regional choices tend to still come out of they're obviously in dialogue with other things in the region, but they often just come out of the specific government and political context in which they find themselves. I think the most that I can do after that incredibly comprehensive answer is basically just plus one, the more disturbing general trend of the fact that we're just seeing, like, the expansion, the normalization, the further refinement of both censorship and shutdown tactics. I mean, the 2019 huge Iran shutdown was total brute force, and there was a lot of downstream economic consequences to that. That was a real desperation move. The last time they did it, it was much more regional. It was only across some networks. It was much more targeted. It showed a lot of evolution. I mean, you could see post-coup in Myanmar, the kind of innovation in control that was happening in real time with, as Natalie mentioned, whitelisting rather than blacklisting as kind of a censorship approach, and then just trying to time intermittent shutdowns around protest schedules. So they'd shut down the internet every night and it would come back in the day, and you could only get certain things. And then, on the censorship side, another kind of disturbing trend we see is just the kit for this stuff is getting much easier to acquire. It used to be that, best in class censorship apparatus, you had to have the motivation and the deep pockets of a PRC to pull it off really well. And now you can kind of, you buy the kit and you get customer service along with it, and it's a lot more plug and play. So yeah, the broader trends are to me even more disturbing than some of the regional variation we see.
Great. And I see questions are beginning to come in. We'll try to get to those toward the end of our discussion. Some of them are very good questions about specific issues in different countries. I'll try to keep us moving along. We're okay on time, but so now let's talk a little bit about circumvention methods, tools in response to these troubling shutdowns. So the U.S. government, through the auspices of its international broadcasting agencies and especially the Open Technology Fund, has been very focused for some time on developing circumvention tools to enable journalists to share their work. Nat, can you give us an overview of what Open Technology Fund is up to, how your programs have evolved, and where you see the future of your work being?
Sure. So OTF is essentially a funding organization that focuses primarily on research, development, maintenance of internet freedom technologies. Our mandate is broadly divided between kind of anti-censorship technologies and increasingly shutdown resistant technologies, and then anti-surveillance tools. We were initially incubated within Radio Free Asia, RFA's content being kind of a lot on China and as kind of hard-hitting as it can be, was obviously one of the first things to kind of get some of the ire of the PRC censorship apparatus. And so it was kind of a natural place for us to be initially incubated. But as online censorship and surveillance has become a more kind of generalized challenge in digital journalism in authoritarian spaces, OTF recently was spun off to become an independent organization under the umbrella of USAGM, the U.S. Agency for Global Media. So in that sense, OTF's mission has always and continues to have a very close relationship with the practice of digital journalism. Essentially, the way we conceive of it is that without anti-censorship technologies, audiences in authoritarian contexts won't be able to reach good, objective, independent journalism. And without anti-surveillance, privacy and security tools, those journalists in country or even in the diaspora, say, won't be able to do the reporting they need to produce that kind of content in the first place. Given the pace of technological and political change, the specific challenges we're responding to on a given day are constantly shifting. But that kind of effect of censorship, shutdowns, and surveillance on journalists, activists, and audiences for their content kind of remains the North Star for what we're investing in from a research and technology perspective.
Well, that's good to hear. And I know that Congress continues to be interested in Open Technology Fund and continues to prioritize that work, seeing it as part of the greater U.S. bipartisan foreign policy of democracy promotion, which includes support for civil societies and journalism. I actually want to come back to something that was mentioned earlier, because it was on my mind, and we have a question from the audience. Nat, you said these plug and play kits. Like, I'm just like, is there some kind of nefarious global conference that happens where all of these authoritarians meet with these belligerent technologists, and they all swap tales, and they all learn how to like use the internet to suppress, organic political movement? Like, how does this happen? How do they learn from each other? Ksenia, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, actually, that's precisely what I was looking for. I'm still looking at it for Russian markets because, I have been researching the markets of surveillance and censorship, and my idea was actually to approach this as an economic interest and not just as a political one. And in case of Russia, I found that now, especially after the full-scale invasion started, the new markets for Russia are, for example, Uzbekistan, but also Kazakhstan and Iran as well, and of course, Afghanistan, which is quite curious, but I'm identifying vendors that make these deep packet inspection tools or lawful interception devices, and they openly speak to these governments, including the Taliban, about how good their solutions are. So I could even find some evidence of that, their participation in conferences in the MENA region, and also their visits to Afghanistan to present these solutions. And this really looks like what you just said. It's a conference of technical vendors, like a fair, like a market, where they would have a stand and they would advertise what the solution can do. They would present with a PowerPoint and explain how good it's filtering the traffic, what it can do apart from filtering, and so on and so forth. So the approach is quite pragmatic here, and it's a lot of turnover. It's a very important market. And Natalia also answered in the chat something about Canadian vendors, and this has been well documented by Citizen Lab. But it's not just Russia, it's also democratic countries that are kind of involved in propagating these solutions to authoritarian regimes.
In the US, NSO Lab has been in the news a lot. The Israeli company that manufactures the Pegasus malware. Are there other companies from countries where we consider them to be in the Western liberal democracy scheme whose companies are perpetuating this? You mentioned Canada, and then
maybe I'll say that we've been looking also into, we have been advocating, in fact, for measures to control proliferation and sale of this kind of technologies, both spyware and surveillance, as were mentioned, but also this kind of filtering technologies that are used for repression. And so, yes, it is Sandvine that I mentioned. That was a firm that sold its technology to Belarus, and then it was used in the 2020 internet shutdowns. And they try to deny their responsibility, actually, and say, well, actually, it's not our problem that our technology is used in such a way. But then as a result of our advocacy and pressure, they had to actually withdraw. And now there's some also legal repercussions for them. But there's other companies. Israeli, there's other companies like Alot. It's also Israeli company that is providing this kind of technologies, and others as well. It's all over, and this is the problem that we think that Western governments, democracies, often EU as well as a big market for biometric technologies, also used for surveillance. And so we're advocating for stronger controls, and the US and both US and EU have recently actually updated their export controls, and EU even included DPI, deep packet inspection technologies, in their updated controls. But however, we will see how effective it's going to be, because for now we are seeing that still companies are led to police themselves, regulate themselves. They are told you determine whether there's something a country poses a risk for human rights, and what we have seen is that they don't care, they don't have understanding of the law, and even if they do, they simply disregard it. And so we certainly need a lot more stricter regulation and control over the sale of these technologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds like a good story. Somebody, I could write that. This is very fertile for my own reporting interests. Thank you. Love it. I don't love it, but yeah. So we're getting lots of good questions coming in. I'm going to try to move expeditiously through the rest of our moderated section so we can get to the audience questions. So a couple months ago, Meta, owner of WhatsApp, was in the news for a good reason. They announced a new feature for their social messaging platform, WhatsApp, that would allow users to still be able to use the service when governments have blocked or shut down connectivity access. This new feature relies on proxy servers run by volunteers and organizations around the world. Considering how popular WhatsApp is outside of the US, especially in some developing countries where it can be the main way of accessing the internet, this could be a really big deal in terms of like, you know, a win for the good guys. But I mean, everything will go down to implementation. So Ksenia and Natalia, can you talk a little bit about what this could be and then kind of how you're seeing it being rolled out and what some hiccups could be? This is going to be run on the backs of volunteers, essentially, from the press reports.
Well, I would maybe start with a general remark about proxies as circumvention tools, because they have shown their relative efficiency. For example, during the Telegram ban in Russia, when Roskomnadzor, a Russian internet watchdog, tried to block Telegram, and Telegram implemented a built-in empty proto proxy that was not supported by volunteers, but was supported by Telegram team. And besides, there were like a proliferation of proxies that were run by individuals. So it was quite efficient, and Telegram apps were constantly pushing new IP addresses for users to connect to. So it depended on the platform, but it was quite efficient. But this IP hopping and this kind of proxy technique had its limits and some even, I would say, undesirable effects because of how Roskomnadzor was censoring and blocking Telegram. They started to block like wide ranges of IPs that supposedly belong to Telegram and accidentally also blocked innocent, unrelated websites, including important governmental services, banking, or other strategic resources. And I'm a bit worried that in case of WhatsApp, if the censor in a given territory applies the same technique of like carpet blocking, taking ranges of IPs and blocking them, I'm afraid that we may expect kind of similar outcomes. So yeah, I'm very optimistic, and like it's interesting for me to observe as a sociologist of technology, but I also have some worries about this as an outcome. And maybe Natalia would complete, and maybe you have another point of view and you're totally optimistic about what WhatsApp is going to do.
No, I think that's right. And it's a good step. And I believe that Signal already has been doing it. So WhatsApp is following Signal steps here. I do think yet also that there are risks, there are benefits and risks to these proxy servers. And one is, besides what Ksenia has mentioned, is also you have to then trust, and especially vulnerable individuals at risk, including journalists in repressive countries. They want to be careful in which proxy servers they're connecting to, because if it's a trusted, as you say, run by volunteers that they know some organizations, it's one thing, but it can also be set up in a way by governments or other adversaries to actually try to still snoop on the people and identify certain relationships, who is talking to who, and still some information that they can gain from this. So again, like it would be good to also explain what proxy servers are and that there are risks and they need to be trusted in order for you to use them for secure communication.
Yeah, there seems to be.
Totally. It's good to remind that proxies are not anonymity tools, because you have to try and trust the provider. And I agree totally with Natalia. It's a big risk, especially because metadata in WhatsApp is not encrypted. So we can trust WhatsApp end-to-end encryption of the content of the messages, but not the social graph and the metadata, of course.
Yeah, so much of this, there's such an extra burden on journalists and democracy activists to educate themselves and to be very proactive and, trying to stay one step ahead of of governments who just have more resources to do this. And I have a question about if Facebook is going to provide, Meta is going to provide any kind of support to kind of help identify trusted proxies that have been like vetted or not, or it's all going to be on the backs of the volunteers.
A blue check mark.
Blue check mark. Elon Musk would probably sue. We are running short on time. So we talked a little bit about the proxy servers. You mentioned Signal, this new WhatsApp feature. Are there other circumvention tools that are coming online that journalists should know about? Nat, Ksenia, Nat, anything you guys are going to roll out in the near future?
I guess it's probably worth noting that everything OTF funds directly is on our site. We try to be as transparent with those kind of things as possible. And we work basically entirely in open source to make sure that, like, even if you don't trust Uncle Sam, you can trust these tools, you can verify how they work themselves. And while certainly there's a lot of interesting bits of innovation happening in both secure communication and the circumvention space, as we have to essentially deal with ever increasing technical sophistication on the part of sensors. I mean, the one that immediately jumps to mind is like trying to essentially deploy what are basically like genetic algorithms to manipulate packets against firewalls to see what gets through. So you essentially don't have to hypothesize how you'll get through. You try to just find ways through in real time. And it's a way to just speed up that cat and mouse game much faster. That's not like that's not in the wild in a way that's easy for users to use quite yet, but it's, you know, there's new techniques that we're having to do to respond basically. But to essentially underline the point that Ksenia and Natalia were making in their last comment about like essentially trust and what's going to happen if you have giant providers of, you know, proxies or VPNs, is just that point of like, to start with what your needs are and do a little bit of like your own risk modeling, threat modeling is so important. I think even when folks have a really good tool, often it's the other tool they're using alongside it that gets them in trouble, because the tool that they're using that is secure or is getting them around is only one little compartment and everything else is insecure or giving away the stuff that they're trying to keep secret. So we definitely encourage folks to dive in, and I think there's lots of more resources available than when we all got into this game in terms of like qualified digital security trainers in every region, ways to get involved with digital rights and internet freedom communities that can help with some of that more bespoke stuff. But to like put too much trust in a single technology as the silver bullet is always going to be tough.
Yep. Ksenia, you want to wrap that up? I mean, we're add on to what Nat said.
Of course, yeah, I would like to actually speak about I agree totally that the tool-centered approach is, well, largely criticized, but still there is a new kind of generation of solutions that take another approach, not the one that VPNs are taking, because a VPN is basically very easy to block. If we speak about circumvention technologies, there is a new generation that is going outside of this cat and mouse game with the sensor and tries to apply different architectures and different approaches, like different protocols. For example, one of the tools with which I'm also helping as a UX researcher and looking at it closer is Sino browser. And Sino browser is well developed by Quality and also has a lot of help from OTF, by the way. And Sino is very different from VPN. It actually uses BitTorrent protocol. So it's like the app that people use in some countries to download movies, which is considered as illegal almost everywhere. But the protocol itself is not illegal. And it is very interesting, very useful to deliver content of websites instead of downloading movies. So you basically connect to blocked news media. For example, if you are a Russian person and you want to read about the war in Ukraine, you want to read the truth, you want to go to Medusa, for example. So it's accessible via Sino browser, and you can not just read yourself on your phone, but you can also share content with other peers, with other Sino users. So you download a website, it's a cached version of a website, and then you can share it. So even if Russia is cut from the global internet, it can still access via Sino Brother static versions or cached versions of these websites. And thanks to injectors that are kind of outside Russia in the free internet, people get updates from these websites. So it's a totally new approach. It's also using some satellite internet, and it's very interesting. And now it's growing. It gets popular, especially in Iran, also in Ukraine and in the occupied territories of Ukraine, especially, and of course in Russia. And it is designed to work in partial shutdowns or behind firewalls. So it's really growing. I just looked the number of peers. It's 100,139 unique peers in the network. So people who are sharing content. And I could compare this to Tor network a little bit in the sense that the more there are nodes, the better it works. So with Sino, it's the same. It's a cooperative web browsing. So it's a new approach instead of like individualist approach of a VPN. Have just this server, I use it for my own sake. I protect myself. Sino is about kind of helping others. And there are other projects that are developed by Equality that I just maybe will just give the names and maybe send the links to the chat because I find them very ingenious. For example, Wikroll, it's kind of based on the same network as Sino, but it's an app for media that are delivered in your pocket like a reader for the cached version of a website. And also there were a lot of efforts to help Ukrainians with accessing free internet, especially in occupied territories, with a service that is called DCOMS, Decentralized Communications, with 8 servers set up across Ukraine in different cities. So if there is a shutdown or Russia occupies this territory, people would still be able to connect inside the local network. So within the same city, at least there is this. So sometimes when you don't have a choice, any kind of connectivity becomes important. So it's not the luxury of getting high-speed, high-quality internet, but at least you can tell your friends that you're alive. And this is the kind of solutions that become interesting. And all of them, all of the solutions that I just enumerated, are actually based on decentralized topologies, decentralized architectures. So I would say that this is the new trend in circumvention tech. It's really moving away from centralized solutions towards a federated or decentralized ones, and distributed ones.
That's so interesting. As authoritarian governments look to centralize control within their hands, the response from the people and journalists is to spread out our access and have like lots of different things that we can do in supportive. And I had another question I wanted to ask, but I do want to get to the Q&A because we have so many substantive questions. So this first question that came in is from Dan O'Malley with the National Endowment for Democracy Center for International Media Assistance. And Dan asks, in addition to reporting on internet shutdowns and throttling as press freedom violations, are there other things that the press can do to address this problem? Is there a potential advocacy role for journalists at the international level alongside other digital rights advocates? You know, I'm thinking of the work Citizen Lab and Access Now does. I mean, this affects us professionally. You know, journalists don't normally like to consider them advocates, but we do advocate for press freedom. You know, we do advocate for that.
Yeah, I'll just say that as I lead our strategic litigation work, take companies and governments to court as journalists, and we've seen that happening in several places where journalists actually sue the governments for implementing shutdowns, for implementing censorship, for surveillance, where their rights are violated. So it's definitely something that we should see more of, and this jurisprudence being developed when journalists are unable to do their work, unable to cover and report on world events because there's no internet, or because there's a retaliation and they're being infected with spyware once they publish an article, or even while they're just doing the investigation. So this is certainly that hurts everyone's rights and hurts press freedom rights. So I encourage more journalists and media rights organizations to actually use legal means to demand accountability and defend their rights. And us and our partners, Media Defense, EFF, other organizations around the world, will be happy to help and support them in this.
Great. Senia?
Yeah, there is also a very concrete technical way to help. You can use UniProbe, which is an app that is available for different platforms from Android and iOS, but also for desktop. And I made research together with journalists from Crimea who actually helped by running tests in Crimea while they were there. And they could help me to gather statistics about the blocking of websites and get the real data about what was happening for them, because they were in this territory during these events. And I could only get this material, and I could only make a report and publish about this and talk about this on various important events like RESCON, for example, or also report to the OTF and make some small changes thanks to this crowd participation of press freedom activists and journalists. So this is another way. You can run UNI if you are not afraid. If you are traveling for a mission to some territory where internet is heavily censored, you can just run the app for a few times and you will help, because you will create the data about censorship, and this data will help researchers, because otherwise we are not sure about what happens there if we don't go there ourselves. So I would say this is an easy way, and I will post the link to the app.
Thank you. I was about to ask, please post that link. I want it to. Nat.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I think, is on the one hand, as this discussion makes clear, the public interest around even some of these more technical topics is really self-evident. So the more that journalists can help demystify some of these things, allow audiences to really understand the technical equities and components that exist as all these political events are unfolding, that's an invaluable service just in kind of public education and awareness. And then also, honestly, like, journalists in many of these places have a very unique and powerful trust relationship with their audiences. And so one thing that we really observed in the initial aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, working with Radio Free Europe, was just as journalists were engaging with their audiences on uncensored social media, they were able to essentially help their audiences with recommendations for ways to continue accessing their content and ways to do it as safely as possible. In a way that really both kept them connected to their audiences, but also provided a measure of support to those audiences in a super direct way that I think most of the journalists ended up feeling like was part and parcel of their journalistic mission, even though the form it took was a little different than usual.
I'm going to combine these next two questions relating to Africa. Michaela Smith asks about the role China's technology influence has in Africa, saying Chinese technology is flooding African markets, happening at a granular level through their affordable techno phones that come with pre-installed malware, deep concerns of privacy violations, and then the influence of China's Huawei telecommunications firm with the more recent incident of Huawei cameras being used to spy on the African Union. Are there organizations that are monitoring this dynamic and how Chinese technology supports control of authoritarian regimes in Africa? And then Daniel Chigundo asks, he writes, several African countries have shut down the internet in the past 5 years. Could one be wrong to attribute this attitude to the coming in of the Chinese in Africa, since China is also restrictive when it comes to internet freedom? If anybody wants to speak on China's role in Africa in this sphere.
Maybe I'll try to answer the second question. I don't think there is a relationship there. I think African governments have their own incentives and capacities to shut down the internet. It's something we're seeing all over the continent, and unfortunately, but however, luckily, we have also seen a lot of advocacy and lawsuits challenging, and in some cases successfully. At the ECOWAS court, for example, we had 2 decisions now against government implemented shutdowns. But I don't think there is China's role here. I think governments have their own reasons to shut down, is to control their populations. We see it during the elections, we see it during protests. But there's definitely a little bit touching upon the first question. I do see definitely China is trying to play, sort of use its own technology to exert certain amount of control and gain information. Perhaps we're seeing that actually in the Central Asia region, where China is even sometimes donating, giving away for free certain technologies, and then it's used for all kinds of mass surveillance in the region. So definitely it's something that we see this trend, but I'm not so familiar with African, relationship with China, African countries' relationship with China. So maybe others can comment more.
I dropped in a link to a report that one of our former fellows did, basically mapping out some of like the surveillance and censorship technology from China and Russia kind of through the rest of the world. And I think when you look at Africa, it is, very firmly along the Belt and Road. And we have lots of, kind of individual reporting around essentially some of the kinds of deals that are made between, certain African regimes and some of the big Chinese infrastructure providers, which is, does fit into that general archetype of that, like, oh, plug and play. We can, give you a safe city setup that then you can use, wink, wink, nod, nod, as you'd like. And the customer support that affords.
We are almost out of time. I wonder if I could squeeze in 2 questions. Our Talita Pessoa from Pen America, she wants to know if you can think of, if any of the panelists know of any specific examples where ethnic groups, cultural groups were specifically targeted, maybe Kurdish communities in Iran. Like, do the governments, do they have that level of specificity control yet? Because that would be very alarming.
I could only speak to the example that I saw with my own eyes when I was researching Crimea, and I could prove it with my colleague Igor Valentovich, who worked with Citizen Lab and also funded by OTF. We looked at Crimean Tatar, who are ethnic Crimean citizens and inhabitants, and they are Muslim, and they have very specific culture, very interesting, very rich one. And they also have their own media. And we saw that these media were blocked heavily and inside Crimea. Outside Crimea in Russia, they were accessible, most of them. So this was interesting because Crimea was kind of a laboratory of information control, especially targeting this specific minority group. Why? First of all, because they were very radically opposing the occupation, and they were pro-Ukrainian. They wanted Crimea to be given back to Ukraine, and they wanted the liberation of Crimea, and they were promoting energetic blockade of Crimea. They were actually allegedly behind some of the attacks on the power grid that was connecting Crimea to north of Ukraine, south of Ukraine, sorry. And Russia was heavily monitoring their media. They were surveyed also. Crimean journalists were facing 20 years, up to 20 years of jail, also for allegedly being terrorists, well, they were not. So this is an example that I know for sure. And so Natalia has another one, I'm sure.
Yeah, just a few countries like Kashmir. We've seen Kashmir is one place where it is, limited to the specific ethnic groups, region. Tigray as well in Ethiopia, Myanmar as well. We see some relationship between attacks on minorities and shutdowns. Indonesia shut down internet in the Papua and West Papua regions, also targeting minority protests. So we have a lot of examples actually.
Yeah,
and I'll just, of course, tag Xinjiang onto that. I mean, it is the CCP's, laboratory for experimenting with surveillance and censorship that goes beyond, that goes into the physical realm. We funded a project a little while back that even looked at the way that they censor the digital representation of physical spaces through censoring like tiles on Baidu maps and things. So, and that's certainly aimed at kind of, an ethnic minority.
This will be, unfortunately, our last question for today's panel. This comes in from journalist Pearl Matibi. She writes that in 2021, Access Now was somewhat vocal about the internet shutdown in Eswatini when there was a protest there. Can you talk about how, if at all, can networks refuse to shut down like a network order from the government? Do they have any flexibility in responding to those orders?
I am not so, because my Keep It On colleagues and also Africa region colleagues would be able to answer better, but I think it is from the cases that I worked on, specifically through litigation. I can say that we see that commonly happening, that telcos are sort of caught in between and often are forced to respond to government orders under various threats. However, we have also seen where telcos would stand up to this and try to challenge orders. We have seen, I believe, in Zimbabwe, in Sudan, where there was specifically challenges, related to telcos, and there was unblocking, I think, in Zimbabwe, where telcos actually disclosed the order that was came from the government, and as a result the shutdowns were lifted. So telcos do play an important role in terms of they have sometimes some way of not only resisting but also providing some transparency, and when the government is denying actually we have nothing to do with this is an accident, telcos also play a role in disclosing that information and saying, hey, actually the government gave us an order and this is how it looks like. So it is complicated, but we do encourage telcos to resist and provide information, and also for individuals to consider also taking telcos to court, because sometimes that might be more effective than government.
No, that's a great point. Telecommunications companies have agency too, and the public can exert pressure on them. So that is it for our questions. Thank you so much to our panelists. You really packed a lot of information into this hour. I learned a lot. Thank you. I think our panelists came away with some great tools as well from what we saw from the questions and comments. We're going to share a link to this video soon, along with a survey and additional resources, so you can keep mining this conversation for further guidance. Open internet access is essential to the practice of journalists and to a free press. We hope you'll consider supporting press freedom with a donation to the NPC Journalism Institute to help us power journalism in the public interest. On behalf of the National Press Club's Press Freedom Team and the Institute, thank you all again for being here. Happy end to Sunshine Week. Stay well, and we hope to see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.